So, children, we are back with the second segment of Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. In this segment, we are going to talk about two revolutions which took place in Russia in 1917, February Revolution and October Revolution, which is popularly known as Bolshevik Revolution. So, let's Here we can see the map of Russia, present day Russia, and you are able to see the Finland, which was part of Russia in 1917, Belarus, which was part of Russia, and it was in 1991 it got split. Part of Poland was also with Russia, Ukraine, a Russian, Soviet, and so on. And now this is the present map of Russia, and we are going to talk about this only. As in the previous segment, we talked about coming up of socialism in Russia, and we have seen that it was George Plekhanov, a follower of Karl Marx. He formed Russian Social Democratic Party in 1883. Though we know before 1914 any of the political party was an illegal party. But this political party has attracted many other socialist groups and they joined this organization which later on was known as Labour Party. Now there was a split in this party that the Russian Social Democratic Party into two, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Mensheviks were the liberals, whereas the Bolsheviks were radicals. February Revolution in Petrograd. The February Revolution, known such because of Russian use of Julian calendar until February 1918, began on March 8, 1917, February 22 on the Julian calendar. Demonstrators clamoring for bread took to the street of Petrograd, supported by huge crowds of striking industrial workers. Women also led and participated in the strike. This came to be known as International Women's Day. Now, at present, we celebrate this day on 8th of March, but it was on 22nd of February, these ladies, these women, they come out and they joined the strike organized by industrial workers. The protesters clashed with the police but refused to leave the street. On March 11, the troops of Petrograd army garrison were called out to quell the uprising. In some encounters, the regiments opened fire, killing demonstrators, but protesters kept to the street and the troops began to waver. The Duma formed a provisional government on March 12. A few days later, Tsar Nicholas abdicated the throne, ending the centuries of Russian Romanov rule. The leader of the provisional government, including young Russian lawyer Alexander Kerensky, established a liberal program of rights such as freedom of speech, equality before law, and the right of union to organize and strike, but they opposed violent social revolution. 1st August, Germany declares war on Russia. 18th August, St. Petersburg is renamed as Petrograd. 30th December 1916, Grigory Rasputin was being assassinated. February Revolution from 8th to 16th of March. 8th March on 1917, International Women's Day, demonstrators, striking workers, many of whom are women, take to the street to protest against food shortages and the war. 15th March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicates and also removes his son from succession. Now, with the establishment of provisional government, some reforms were introduced by the provisional government. Restriction of public meetings and associations were removed. Soviets were set up everywhere. Individual area factory committees were formed, which began questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. Soldiers' committees were formed in army. Now, these reforms were being introduced, but in spite of introducing the reforms, the provisional government found that its power was declining and Bolshevik influence was growing. So they decided to take a stern measure against the spreading discontent. Attempts It resisted attempts by the worker to run the factories and arrested Bolshevik leaders. Born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870, Lenin was drawn to revolutionary cause after his brother was executed in 1887 for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. He was arrested and was sent to exile in Siberia for 3 years. After the outbreak of Russian Revolution of 1905, Lenin returned to Russia. The revolution, which consisted mainly the strikes throughout the Russian Empire, came to an end when Nicholas II promised reforms, including adoption of a Russian constitution and the establishment of elected legislature. However, once order was restored, the Tsar nullified most of these reforms, and in 1907 Lenin was again forced into exile. Contribution of Vladimir Lenin. His name became inseparable from Revolution of 1917. He organized the Bolshevik Party as an instrument for bringing about revolution. He set forth the fundamental laws for a successful revolution, and the very important thing that he has given the slogan all powers to the Soviets. Now when we talk about Soviet, so it's actually a group elected to govern a region. Either it is going to be the local area, or it is going to be industries or army. In Communist Party, in place of calling them councils, they are called Soviets. And when we talk about USSR, United Socialist Soviet Republic, so this was made up of 15 Soviet republics consisting Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. The fourfold demand of Russian revolutionary. First, land to the tiller. Second, control of industry was to be handed over to the workers because they were inspired by the theories of Karl Marx. Peace for all. That means now when they will come into the power, they are going to leave the World War I. An equal status was to be granted to non-Russian nationalists living in Russian territory. Bolshevik Revolution. On November 6 and 7, 1917, or October 24 and 25 on the Julian calendar, which is why the event is often referred as October Revolution. Leftist revolutionary led by Bolshevik Party leader Vladimir Lenin launched a nearly bloodless coup d'etat against the Duma's provisional government. The provisional government had assembled by a group of leaders from Russia's bourgeois capitalist class. Lenin instead called for a Soviet government that would be ruled directly by the Council of Soldiers, Peasants, and Workers. As Lenin was feared that provincial government would set up a dictatorship, he began discussions for an uprising against the government. In September, he began discussions for uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in army, Soviet, and factories were brought together. On November 6 and 7, 1970, or October 24-25 on the Julian calendar, which is why the event is often referred as October Revolution. Leftist revolutionaries led by Bolshevik Party Vladimir Lenin launched a nearly bloodless coup d'etat against the Duma's provincial government. The, the provincial government had to be assembled by a group of leaders from Russian bourgeois capitalist class. Lenin instead called for a Soviet government that would be ruled directly by the Council of Soldiers, Peasants, and Workers. It was on 16th October 1917 Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power. A military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet to organize seizure, led by Trotsky. Uprising began on 24th October. Prime Minister Kerensky left the city to summon the troops. In response, Military Revolutionary Committee ordered to seize government offices and arrest the ministers. The Aurora ship shelled the Winter Palace. Other ships took over the strategic points. By night, the city was taken over and the ministers had surrendered. As we can see, it was on 7th and 8th November 1917 the Bolsheviks seized control of the Petrograd. It was on 25th of November 1917 elections to the Constituent Assembly take place. The Socialist Revolutionary win the largest number of the seats while the Bolsheviks win less than 1/4 of the vote. Now, here is the effect or the outcomes of October Revolution. As we can see that this was the main demand of Bolsheviks, that industries should be owned by workers. So what was being done? It was in November 1970. Most of the industries and banks were nationalized. Now they were the property of the government or the society. Land was declared a social property, and it was being told that people are not going to use the old aristocratic titles. New uniforms were designed for army and officials. Later on, we will come to know that they were called Reds. Russia became one-party state. A process of centralized planning was introduced. This led to economic growth. Industrial production increased because of all these changes which came to the society. Now we are going to see a video to recapitulate what we have learned in this segment.
The February Revolution had been remarkably swift and bloodless, and hopes were now high for the creation of a more democratic, more just Russian state. Members of the State Duma, the National Assembly, had formed a provisional government, which was to hold power until a constituent assembly was elected, to give Russia a new constitution. But in reality, the provisional government shared power with the Petrograd Soviet, a council elected by workers and soldiers that controlled the capital's troops, transport, and communications. The Petrograd Soviet, dominated by the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the Marxist Menshevik Party, was much more radical than the provisional government. Yet it supported the government's decision to continue the war and honor the commitments that Russia had made to the Allies. It was a fateful decision that ultimately played into the hands of one of the smaller parties, the Bolsheviks. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, recently returned from 16 years in exile, bitterly opposed the imperialist war. He also demanded the immediate redistribution of land, from rich landowners to peasants, and the transfer of power from the bourgeois provisional government to the people's soviets or councils that were springing up across Russia. The Bolshevik program was summed up in a simple slogan: bread, peace, and land. And as Russia's economic and military crisis deepened, its appeal to the masses grew and grew. In June, a new Russian military offensive ended in disaster, with 400,000 Russian casualties, massive desertions, and the collapse of army morale and discipline. In July, soldiers and sailors in Petrograd mutinied. They were joined in the streets by workers with Bolshevik support. But troops loyal to the provisional government opened fire on the protesters and dispersed the crowds. A police crackdown followed, leading to the arrest of several Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky. While Lenin, with the help of Joseph Stalin, fled to Finland, traveling with forged papers under the name of Konstantin Ivanov. A socialist and stirring orator named Alexander Kerensky became Russia's new prime minister and was hailed as the man who would save Russia from anarchy. The army's commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, believed Russia's war effort was being undermined by chaos at home and deliberately sabotaged by men like Lenin, whom he declared a German spy. So in August, he ordered his men to march on Petrograd to restore order. Bolsheviks played a leading role in the city's defense against this attempted military coup. Their most brilliant organizer, Leon Trotsky, was released from prison and sent armed Bolshevik militias, the Red Guards, to defend key points in the city. Strikes by railway workers, many of them Bolshevik supporters, prevented Kornilov from moving his men by rail, and his soldiers began to switch sides, or simply go home. The Kornilov affair cast the Bolsheviks as saviors of the revolution. And by the end of September, they'd gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. In October, Lenin decided the time had come. He secretly returned from Finland to Petrograd and began preparing to seize power. On the 25th of October, the Bolsheviks made their move. Red Guards and loyal troops seized key points around the capital, and that night they stormed the provisional government's headquarters at the Winter Palace, an event later immortalized by Bolshevik propaganda, and the great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Kerensky fled the city at the last moment, narrowly avoiding capture. And the next day, at the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, Lenin announced the overthrow of the provisional.
With this, we come to the end of this segment. Hope you must have understood that what were the events that led to February Revolution and what were the outcomes. You must have understood that why the Menshevik government was always on the target of Bolshevik government. How the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. After watching the video, kindly go through these very short questions. Hope you will be able to answer it. If you are unable to answer it, don't get disheartened. Revisit the video and read the chapter, and this is how you will be able to answer these questions. Thank you. We are going to see you in the next video again.